6 Cognitive Tools for Focus. There's a particular kind of frustration that doesn't have a clean name. It's not laziness. It's not disorganization. It's the feeling of sitting down to do something important, something you genuinely want to finish, and watching yourself drift. Your eyes are on the screen, your hands are on the keyboard, but something inside you has quietly left the room. You've probably tried the obvious fixes: a new app, a timer, a to-do list with color-coded categories that felt productive to make but didn't actually help you work. And after a while, you start to wonder if there's something wrong with the machinery itself, if your brain is simply built differently, if focus is a thing that other people do easily and you've somehow been excluded from that. That story, the one that frames a wandering mind as a broken mind, is one of the most common and least useful things we tell ourselves about attention. What we're really talking about here is focus, not as a personality trait you either have or don't, not as a measure of discipline or intelligence, but as a cognitive state that can be shaped, entered, and sustained if you understand what's actually going on underneath it. And most people have never been told what's actually going on underneath it. The brain is not designed to hold attention. That might sound like a strange thing to say, but neurologically it's accurate. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions that becomes highly active when you're not focused on a task, is essentially the brain's baseline state. It's the mind wandering, making meaning, simulating futures, replaying the past. This is not malfunction. This is what the brain does when nothing demands its immediate attention. Researchers like Marcus Reichel, who helped map the default mode network in the early 2000s, found that this internal mental activity is metabolically expensive and constant. Your brain isn't waiting to be focused. Focused is the interruption. This matters because it reframes the whole problem. Struggling to focus isn't a sign that something is broken. It's a sign that you're a person, and your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The challenge isn't fixing yourself, it's learning to work with the architecture you actually have. That architecture was shaped long before adulthood. The attention systems in the brain, particularly those involving the prefrontal cortex and its ability to override distraction, developed slowly over decades, and they're sculpting by experience. People who grew up in unpredictable environments often developed attention systems tuned for threat detection, for monitoring change, for staying ready rather than staying still. People who were frequently interrupted, or who learned early that tasks rarely led to reward, often struggle with sustained engagement, not because they're incapable of it, but because their nervous systems learn to stay mobile. What looks like an inability to focus is often a finely tuned adaptation, doing exactly what it was trained to do. And it's worth saying plainly, there is no ideal way to be. People whose attention moves fluidly, who jump between ideas and stimuli, often have a breadth and associative richness that deeply focused minds can miss. People who can lock in and sustain attention deeply often miss the peripheral signals that others catch immediately. Neither pattern is superior. They're different relationships with a shared cognitive resource. Here is where it gets interesting, though. Cognitive tools for focus don't work by forcing the brain to do something unnatural. The ones that actually hold up under research work by aligning with how attention functions in the first place. There are roughly 6 of them, and they're counterintuitive in ways that most productivity advice never touches. The first is specificity of intention, not a goal, but a precise image of the first physical action you'll take. Research on implementation intentions, particularly the work of psychologist Peter Gollwitzer, shows that deciding exactly when, where, and how you'll begin a task dramatically increases follow-through, not because of willpower, but because the brain responds to concrete sensory cues in ways it doesn't respond to abstract ambitions. The second is managing the transition, not just the task. Focus doesn't begin the moment you sit down. There's a lag, and fighting it makes it longer. Acknowledging that your brain needs a few minutes to shift out of its default state and designing a short ritual that signals the transition uses the brain's associative learning to your advantage. The third involves constraint rather than expansion. An open, unstructured block of time is cognitively harder to enter than a bounded one. Knowing you have 4 hours actually makes it harder to start than knowing you have 25 minutes. Time constraints reduce the psychological weight of beginning. The fourth is environmental design. The prefrontal cortex, which handles directed attention, is relatively fragile under high cognitive load or stress. It's also the part of the brain most affected by physical context. What surrounds you during focused work isn't just background, it's actively shaping which neural circuits are active. The fifth is strategic disengagement. The brain consolidates information and restores attentional resources during rest, particularly during states that allow the default mode network to process without pressure. Scheduled breaks aren't interruptions to focus. For many people, they're what makes sustained focus possible at all. The sixth is what some researchers call the value signal. The brain's attentional systems are tightly linked to its reward systems. When the prefrontal cortex can clearly connect a current task to something that matters, it modulates distraction differently. This isn't motivation in the cheerleading sense, it's neurological. The salience of what you're doing changes what your brain filters in and out. None of this is a prescription. Some of these tools will fit your cognitive style and some won't. The point isn't to optimize yourself into someone else's version of productive. The point is to have a more accurate map of the territory, so that when focus comes, and when it doesn't, you understand why. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are a person with a particular nervous system, shaped by a particular history, trying to do something meaningful in a world that was not designed with your brain in mind. That's a harder problem than it sounds, but it's also a more interesting one. If something in this landed for you, there's a related thread worth following. It has to do with why certain kinds of work feel effortless, while others feel like pushing a boulder uphill, and what that split actually tells you about the way your brain is organized.